Well, over the last couple of weeks, the world has really been, I'd say, almost obsessed with the story of 12 Thai boys and their soccer coach who were trapped in a cave complex after rising water made it impossible for them to get out. Is there anybody here who hasn't heard that story? No, it's not possible, is it? You'd have to have been, out in the bush somewhere with no radios or newspapers or anything for you to have missed it. And we saw how what was supposed to be a fun-filled excursion for an hour turned into 9 days without food, 17 days trapped underground, and a near-death experience on the way out. Not to mention the near-death experience and in fact, a scuba diver who did give his life in the process of rescuing them. And stories like these remind us of how life can change so dramatically in a moment. For some of us, it might be a car accident, an illness, a job loss, or maybe the sudden death of a loved one. The things that we take for granted are suddenly not there. And we have to figure out how to adjust and what we're going to base our life on, because sometimes we've kind of based our life on some of those things. And Jesus addressed this in the parable of the rich fool, found in Luke chapter 12, which I'll invite you to turn to. Luke chapter 12 from 13 to 21. And we read there that someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, meaning his disciples, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich towards God." Now, I would guess that there aren't any farmers here today. And Jesus was speaking to people who lived in an agricultural area. They understood this story very well. It was very real to them. So I thought I might just retell it in a little more of a GTA context this morning. There was a young man who started his own business and was successful. His bank accounts grew. He reinvested in his business, and the business kept on growing. He bought himself a nice car and house. And then his business growth exploded, and he became a billionaire overnight. He said to himself, "I know what I'll do. I'll buy a mansion and a Lamborghini and live it up. I will sell my business and retire to an easy life. I can live off the interest for the rest of my life." But God said to him, "You fool. Tonight you're going to die, and what good will all your wealth do you then? This is how it will be for everyone who keeps to themselves all that God blesses them with, instead of using it to further God's kingdom." Now, I don't know if the second version speaks to you a little bit more directly. It's a little more real to our situation here in Pickering, even though not most of us have a business that's exploded like that. But Jesus told these simple, short stories, parables, or as Pastor Maria said, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. In other words, a story people could relate to so that they could learn something spiritually, something that would impact their life on a deeper level. And in these parables, we always need to look for one point. Sometimes Jesus tells a parable and explains that there's a couple of points, but most of the time, he has one thing in view. And often we need to look at the context of the parable to see, why is Jesus telling us this parable? And that helps us to pick out what Jesus' main point, the one thing that he was trying to emphasize to his hearers, is. And the immediate context of this parable is, of course, the first couple of verses that I read, where a man said to Jesus, Jesus is in the middle of teaching, and in a sense he interjects and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now you might think that's a strange thing for somebody to ask Jesus to do. I mean, Jesus was a traveling teacher. Why ask him? Have you ever been in a situation, maybe it was even in your home, where there's several of you sitting around the table and things are not very happy, and maybe a father says to a child, "Tell your mother blank." Now, hopefully you deal with conflict more healthily than that. But maybe you've been in a workplace where those kinds of things happen, and you have people who are not talking to one another. And they'll say, go, tell that person, even though they're right there, and they could tell them very well themselves. And so we don't know. Maybe the brother was there. At the same time, maybe the brother wasn't there. It was also common in those days for people to ask rabbis, teachers, to settle disputes. And in fact, that continues today. Sometimes people will come to a pastor here at PPC and say, "Can you settle this for me?" instead of going through things the way that the Bible tells us, to confront somebody directly. And of course, in many cultures, including the Jewish one that Jesus lived in, first sons received the lion's share of the inheritance. In fact, Jewish law said that they received a double portion. So that means if there were two brothers, that the older brother received 2/3 of the estate and the younger brother 1/3. And so we don't know what's happening here. It's possible that the younger brother is talking to Jesus and saying, "I don't feel like the division was fair." Or it's possible that the older brother was saying, "It's all mine. You go, you've got enough in life. You do what you want with what you have. You're not getting anything from the estate." In any case, they felt like there was a deep injustice done to them. And I want to just hover here for a moment, because I know that some of us today might feel like we've had an injustice done in our life. And I think it's important to note Jesus' response to that injustice. Jesus didn't say, "Oh, you poor thing. What an awful thing to have happened to you. You're not getting your just dues. For sure, I will talk to your brother. I will straighten this out, or try to straighten this out. I'll tell him what he should do." Because, there are some people today who'd suggest that this is the main role of the church, that we should be fighting for justice in our society. And while the Bible is full of teaching that we do need to be a people who are just, and we do need to speak out for the widow and the orphan and those who are oppressed, that's not the main message. And what does Jesus say to this person? He doesn't say, "Well, I'm going to help you deal with the injustice that you're facing." In fact, he points out to this person that they have a heart problem. He says, "Who am I to be an arbiter in this situation?" But he goes on to tell this story about greed and warning his disciples about greed while that person is still there. And sometimes when we feel angry about things, even if there's been an injustice done to us, God is not nearly as concerned with solving our problem as he is with the attitude of our heart. In fact, I think it's safe to say that he's always more concerned with the attitude of our heart than he is with the situation that we're facing. And so if we're facing an injustice today, if we're facing a difficult situation, somewhere that causes us to feel anger, we need to ask ourselves, "God, how do you want my heart to be in this situation? Am I responding as you would have me respond?" It's not always about justice. Inheritance does strange things to people. In fact, I think of it as similar to winning the lottery a little bit, except that it's a little more expected. There's a little higher chance, maybe, that you would receive an inheritance than winning the lottery. You suddenly get a whole bunch of something, usually. Sometimes an inheritance is small. But people often don't handle this well. I don't know if you heard this story this week about a Nova Scotia woman and her nephew who won the lottery together. Now, the woman had bought the ticket, but she put her name and her nephew's name on it. And she says that she just put his name on for luck. Maybe she feels like her nephew's a lucky guy. But she paid for the ticket. And so she says, the winnings are mine. And so in fact, they said that when they present, with this great big symbolic check, and her nephew and her were standing there, and they snapped the picture, and then she turned to her nephew and said, "See you in court." And in fact, she said later that, before all of this happened, she would have probably given her nephew a couple $100,000 because he's like the son she never had, that now he is dead to her because he hasn't agreed to give up his share of the lottery ticket. Now, you could take either side of this, right? She bought the ticket. She's entitled to the $1.2 million. You could feel that way. Or you could say, the nephew can say, my name's on that ticket, and it's $600,000 that you didn't even expect to get. You just put in a couple of dollars to get it. You can look at it either way. Either one of them can be angry. And yet they've wrecked their relationships for the sake of something that they never even expected to get in the first place. I think that's the sort of thing, that's what, not that we need to win the lottery for this principle to apply, but that's why Jesus is saying, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. There's a saying that we should love people and use things, but too often we reverse that, and we use people and love things. In 1 Corinthians 6, verse 7, Paul points out to the believers there and says that it would be better to be cheated than for them to be suing one another and dragging the image of Jesus, of the church, of what he's called them to do through the mud before all these people who don't know the Lord. And so we begin with a word of caution about our attitude in our heart when we face difficult situations. But really, this whole chapter, the larger context, is an examination of our priorities. It begins with the Pharisees. Jesus warns his disciples not to be like the Pharisees who prioritized their reputation. And so he warns his disciples that what you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight. What you've whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs. He says, don't worry. Don't try to present a reputation out there. Don't make that your first priority. Think about what's happening in secret. It has to line up with what's out there. If you look back in chapter 11, again, he's pronouncing woes against this same group of people that had their priorities wrong. They prided themselves on serving the Lord, and yet their priorities were all out of whack. They looked at the outside instead of the inside. Beyond our reputation, Jesus continued to talk to the disciples in the next verses about our natural priority for our own safety and comfort. God has put these natural reactions in us so that we'll avoid danger. But on the other hand, he calls us to risk for his kingdom, to step out and be counted. And that's what Jesus tells his disciples. He tells them not to worry about when they face opposition and persecution, but instead that they need to say who they are, that they serve God, the one true God, no matter what the cost is. And then Jesus comes to this parable in the context of the man who asked him about sharing of the inheritance. And Jesus points out that we have this natural priority for material possessions. And his message in this parable really is that we should be reminded of how temporary life is. That not one of us is guaranteed tomorrow. And that what really matters is the next part of our life, in eternity. That this is our opportunity to invest for the future. Not a future here on earth, but our ultimate future. I was reading this week about minimalism, also known as simple living. And it's this idea, it's not a new idea, it's been around thousands of years for various different reasons, but probably one of the more recent recent examples of this is Gandhi, of course, in the 1940s, when he recognized the oppression that was happening to his people was in part because they were all trying to have everything that their British overlords had. And so he said to everyone, we need to start living simply within our means so that we are no longer beholden to the very people who are oppressing us. But in the last few years, minimalism has become almost a fad, where people have begun to realize the tyranny of things. Do you know that everything that we own, we either have to maintain or replace, or guard, or store in some way? And all of those things cost us time and energy and money. You can think about anything that you possess, including the clothes that are on your back right now. And you have to wash them, right? You have to, in some cases, press them and hang them up. And when they wear out, you need to replace them. And some of us do far more than that. We have all sorts of clothes in our closet, far more than we really need. Well, a minimalist looks at that and says, I don't really need all of that stuff. And I'm going to strive to only have what I actually will use on a regular basis. And you know, people who have done this have thrown out or given away or sold thousands and thousands of dollars worth of things. One person I read about had gotten rid of 20,000 things out of her household as a result of this commitment. There's a website called The Minimalists, and they talk about how they both had six-figure jobs, but one of them had experienced a divorce and the death of his mom and started to rethink his life and realized that he was not working to live, he was living to work. And that was part of the reason that his marriage had fallen apart. And so he just started to get rid of things, and he eventually decided to give up the job he was in because the pressure was too much, and having a six-figure income wasn't worth it. And so he went into a job that would enable him to pursue his passion. And you know, these people talk about how much freedom they feel, how much happier they feel when they've gotten rid of all these stuff. And you know, they're not all Christians, they're not all, I'm sure that they aren't all happy, as they say, but I think that this is one of the sort of things that should cause us to pause and ask ourselves as Christians, have we just bought into materialism? Are we pressured and unhappy and stressed because of the lifestyle that we're trying to maintain? You see, our daily decisions display our priorities. I'll say that again. Our daily decisions display our priorities. It's not just that at some point we say at an altar, Lord, I give my life to you. And then we go on living the way that we always did. Our daily decisions, what you do when you leave here today, how you decide even to listen to this message right now, displays where your priorities are. If you're thinking about all the things that you need to do later, instead of saying, Holy Spirit, what would you say to me this morning? That displays where your priorities are. Everything that we choose to do with our time, our resources like money and our talents and abilities, these are a display of our priorities. And we need to ask ourselves, just as Jesus put his finger on the heart of this man and said, your priorities are out of whack. And he warned his disciples, who had almost nothing, by the way. And yet Jesus felt he needed to warn his disciples and those who were following after him, watch out, be careful, be on your guard against materialism, against greed. And if they had so much less than what we have today, don't you think that that's a message that we need even more? I see a few nodding heads. I think we do. Even if we've heard this message 100 times before. This wasn't the first time Jesus had talked about money to his disciples and materialism. In fact, we'll see if you read the Gospels that he talked about it over and over. And he wasn't passing around an offering plate as he did it either. He was teaching a life principle that he lived out. And so I want to encourage us today that we need to continually come back to this and ask ourselves, are we just living the way the world does? Living for our own priorities instead of God's priorities? Does our life truly illustrate Jesus' words that life does not consist in an abundance of possessions? Or is it actually the opposite? That it looks like that's all we're living for? You know, everyone knows that this is true intellectually. Not even, you don't have to be a Christian to think that it's stupid to just live for money and wealth and possessions. Lots of people think that. But you know, we don't live that way so often. Even though we know the truth, even though we can even tell other people about it, we fall for the same traps. Billionaire Malcolm Forbes is said to have said, "He who dies with the most toys wins." But in fact, he who dies with the most toys dies. And the Bible tells us that he then faces the judgment just like everybody else, and in fact may be at a significant disadvantage. That's why God says to this man, "You fool! You were given all of this, all of these resources, and you just piled them up in a barn? You could have done so much more, been so much more effective with your life, instead of living it all focused on yourself." And that's what I believe God's word challenges us to today. In a recent song, Canadian rapper Drake wrote, "Is there more to life than digits and banking accounts? Is there more to life than saying I figured it out? Am I missing something that's more important to find?" I think it's pretty safe to say that Drake is missing something that's much more important. His net worth is supposedly $60 million, and yet you can tell that he is searching for life's purpose, for something more than what he has. That being at the top of the music scene isn't what he thought it would be. His current life theme apparently is YOLO. You only live once. And while there's two different ways to spin on that, I think it's pretty clear from his lifestyle and his writing that his philosophy of you only live once is really a translation of what we read about the rich fool who says, "I'm going to take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." You only live once, right? Enjoy it, live it up. That's what our society would say. We get so focused on the 80 or so years that we have here on earth, not remembering that this is temporary, that the investments that we make in people, in following what God has for us, those are the things that last. Psalm 39, verses 4-7 says, "Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. Everyone is but a breath, even those who seem secure, like the rich. Surely everyone goes around like a mere phantom. In vain they rush about, heaping up wealth without knowing whose it will finally be. But now, Lord, What do I look for? My hope is in you. That psalm could have been written about the rich fool, heaping up wealth, rushing about without knowing whose it will finally be. I hope that that is not the story of any of us. But even if it has been your story, that can change today. You can make a decision today to not make that your top priority. And you don't have to be rich to make this the top priority. That's why Jesus spoke to those people who had so much less than we do and said, don't be greedy. Whether you're poor or whether you have no worries financially, you can still be obsessed with your possessions. You can still be greedy. What if everything you've ever wanted you don't actually need? What if everything you think you own actually owns you? Have you ever stopped and asked yourself, why is it that I want the thing that I want? Maybe it's a new phone or a computer or a car or if you're younger, a toy of some kind, or I know some people are into hobbies like paintballing or something like that, and they want the latest gadget with, all the maximum amount of pressure so that they can shoot their friends when they're out playing together. Maybe your hobbies are a little more peaceful. But we all probably have a weak spot there. And we need to ask ourselves, why is it that I want this? God doesn't want us to be misers. He doesn't want us to go around always, being intense about everything. Jesus enjoyed life. When I read the Gospels, I see a joyful person who people were attracted to and wanted to know his secret, wanted to know more about him because of the way that he lived his life. And yet he had almost nothing. He said, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He was a joy-filled person. And I think as Christians, we need to have that balance of understanding that we need to live life on purpose. And we should be characterized by joy as we do it. You can become so intense about things, like the minimalists who become so intense about being minimal that they forget the point. The point is to free yourself up to do what you really want to do in life. And of course, as Christians, for us, it's to do what God really wants us to do in life. But this parable demonstrates to us, again, that what we would consider our personal business, God wants to direct us in that. So many of us would also think about this rich man. What's wrong with tearing down the barns and making bigger ones? There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong with, feeding stuff back into my business so that the business will grow? Essentially, that's what he was doing. And there may be nothing wrong at certain points in your career with doing those things. Only God knows where your heart is. And whether you're doing what he wants you to do in your area of business, or if you get a raise. So often when we get a raise, the first thing we think of is, oh, can I afford another car? Can I? Instead of thinking, Lord, you have blessed me with this. I had enough before this. I was getting by. What do you want me to do with this? And even if we don't get a raise, I think we need to ask ourselves those same questions and say, Lord, you have blessed me with so much. What do you want me to do with it? Jesus tells us through this parable that our everyday decisions matter. It's the little things. What we decide to do each day as we get up, not the big decisions that truly display our priorities. There's so many ways that I could suggest today that we need to live this out. Of course, The parable is about finances and how we deal with them. And in our society, we have so many unhealthy patterns like maxing out our credit cards and only paying minimum balances on bills and those kinds of things that put people in bondage. Instead of joy in their possessions, they end up in bondage to their possessions. But I could talk about so many other things. How we use our time. We're a screen-obsessed generation. Pick your screen. Is it your phone, your computer, or your television? It's one of those things. So much time wasted when God has called us to have an impact. And so we need to ask ourselves, what are the choices I'm making with my time, my energy, my resources? And God, what are the choices you want me to make? Maybe we need to cut up the credit cards. Maybe we need to talk to our boss about, that we're changing our lifestyle and we need to hire more people and I'll take a pay cut. Or maybe we need to look for a different job. Or maybe we need to downsize our house because we're living beyond our means. Maybe we just need to simplify. Maybe we need to look at our heart, and this really is the point of the parable, and say, God, am I living for things instead of you? Am I living for all sorts of other purposes that everybody else tells me I need to be a well-rounded individual, instead of living out that unique purpose and plan that you've given to me for my life? If God told you tonight that this was it, tomorrow you're in heaven. Or, hopefully. If God told you that it was tonight, and you look back on your life, what have you accomplished? And I'm not talking about world-changing encounters. What have you done with what you've been given? Will we hear, well done, good and faithful servant? Because we've lived life on God's purpose. 1 Timothy 6:7 says, we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. And we need to remember that. And of course, Jesus in this parable spoke directly to giving. And of course, the parable is about money, so his application, in a sense, fits money, but it fits all these other areas of our life as well. That whatever God has blessed us with, we're responsible for what we do with it. And it's so easy when we talk about giving to put it off. If you're a student, you can think, well, I only have a little part-time job and I don't have a lot of time because I'm busy with my studies. I'll serve God, with my time and my money when I graduate from school. But you graduate from school and you have student debt and, you have to work hard to get that debt off and, you're looking maybe for a spouse and so you're spending lots of time socializing and who has time for all of that? And then you get married and, the kids come along and before you know it, you're worried about saving up for their education and their wedding and your retirement. Do you see that there's kind of a circle here that's happening? There's always something. And Jesus was challenging his disciples now. And so I believe our challenge today, that God's word is challenging us today, now, in this moment. What is God calling you to do? Where is your heart? Where are your priorities? Where is your treasure? As I was thinking about this, I was thinking that one of our attitudes has to be, in a sense, that if God said, I need this about anything in our life, speaking time, resources, energy, finances, material things that we have, if God said, I need this, I want you to give it to, could we do it? I need you right now to stop what you're doing and help that person. But Lord, I'm on my way to work. Could we do it? You know, this exact test happened of somebody in Jesus' day when Jesus sent his disciples after a donkey, a foal of a donkey, a young colt. And he said, go and untie, you'll find a colt in such and such an area, untie it and bring it to me so I can ride it into town. And if somebody asks you, what are you doing with that colt? Tell them the master needs it. Well, if you think about it, who is the one who's going to ask, what are you doing with that colt? The owner. It's my colt. What if I don't get it back? He probably didn't have a whole lot of animals. Most people in that day were fairly poor, and having an animal, a lot of them didn't even have to carry burdens. And so having a foal or a colt of a donkey meant that he was going to, hopefully that meant he owned the mother and was able to sell this one, and it would help increase things. What if you take my nest egg? The master has need of it. If Jesus said the master has need of it to you today, what would your response be? The thing that you most dearly love, the thing that you spend the most time thinking about, would we be able to let it go? Because Jesus teaches in this last part of the chapter that when we give, God provides for our needs. I don't think it's a coincidence that right after this parable, Jesus talks to his disciples and says the pagan world runs after all these things. He said, don't worry about what you're going to wear or what you're going to do or all these things. He said, the pagan world runs after all this stuff. And your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. And the very next words he says are, do not be afraid. It's not just materialism that gets us. It's the fear. Well, what will happen if I don't have a retirement plan? What will happen if I don't have enough to help my kids get through school? What will happen? Do we believe that God is our provider? Have we not seen how God answers prayer? Even just at the beginning of my message when we talked about the situation where really we could have felt, and we probably did feel in a sense hopeless. The government is just changing things and we can see that it's causing additional problems for our kids. What can we do? But as we pray, we see that God answers prayer. And in the same way, I believe that if God is asking you to give something up, that he will show himself faithful. That's what Jesus promised his disciples. That's what his word promises us today too. And so as the worship team comes today, I believe that each of us has a place in our heart that God has been speaking to us about throughout our time together this morning. And I say each of us because I know that this is such a message with such a wide application. It doesn't just have to do with our finances or our approach to material things. There's always another area for us to grow. Always another area for us to say, yes, Lord, I'm going to give this to you. Even as I was preparing this message, God brought up something to my mind that over the last number of weeks I've just been thinking about and wondering and maybe even worrying a little bit. And God said, will you give that to me? And I had to say, yes, Lord, I'll give that to you. I'll trust you that you are more than enough. That's the wonderful thing about God, is that he's more than enough. That doesn't mean that we'll always be healthy, wealthy, and everything goes great for Christians. We go through times of struggle, but God shows himself to be more than enough. He is our strength. He is our hope. He is our joy. He is our provider.